Go ahead, just try to pronounce that word. Okay, in all fairness, it's actually not that hard to pronounce, it just looks intimidating. Okay, when I reviewed Telengard back in episode 54, I went easy on its incredibly random and luck-driven nature because of the fact that it was an extremely old game that helped pioneer the dungeon crawl genre. Today's ancient DOS game, Caverns of Xaskazien, doesn't have that excuse because it came out in the mid-90s. And then to be fair, this DOS version is horribly out of date, since nearly a decade later a Windows port was created and was routinely updated all the way up to around February of 2010. So even though there's a substantially better Windows version of this game available, I figured it'd be fun to take a look at where it all began. Not exactly a great decision though, because this particular version is hard as nails and frustrating beyond belief. I mean seriously, despite numerous playthroughs, I rarely get past the third floor, and you're expected to get through 30 of these. Now, for as bad as it seemed to be at this game, it does have plenty of content, and all the way up to the point where I finally just said screw it, I was still encountering new things I hadn't encountered before, so at least the game never gets boring. Anyways, enough preamble, let's see some game stats. Caverns of Xaskazien was developed by Jeff Sinisak and published by Little Devils in 1995. Now, if that guy's name sounds familiar, you're probably thinking of the Canadian actor and writer Jeff Sinisak, who starred in Android Reenactment, the recent award-winning web series Clutch, and wrote the e-novel Dawn at the Royal Star. Yeah, it's actually the same guy. Totally caught me by surprise. I mean, really, how many actors can you name off the top of your head who also know how to code games? Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyways, Caverns of Xaskazien is a one-player dungeon crawl, and yes, after all this time, I'm finally covering a game that predominantly uses VGA 640 by 480 16-color graphics. For all of you who've been wondering why I haven't really covered any games which use that particular high-resolution VGA video mode, well, it's because very few games use it in the first place, primarily because you can't do page flipping in it, which is an extremely important technique for doing real-time gameplay. Which also explains why most of the games written to use this video mode aren't action-based. As for sound support, the DOS version did originally have Sound Blaster support, but the necessary files aren't included anymore, so instead, you're going to be stuck with the PC speaker. As for its current release date, the game's always been freeware, and the current place to download it from is the Code Dread website at www.codedread.com. And yes, both the DOS and Windows versions can be obtained from there. And I highly recommend obtaining the Windows version instead of the DOS version if you value your sanity. So the story for the game is pretty much non-existent. All you really have to go on is that there's some evil archdemon called Xaskazien residing at the bottom of a maze of caverns, and you've decided to take it upon yourself to go and slay him. I don't know, maybe your character just got bored or something, especially considering his brilliant plan involves delving into these caverns with nothing more than a dagger and his faith in the gods. Which obviously isn't that strong, considering that in one of my many games I was insta-killed for praying to them. Yeah, something I need to address right away is that this game is entirely based on luck. Virtually everything that happens in this game is a result of random chance, be it a good effect or a bad effect. So the only way to survive is to learn how to skew these numbers in your favor when you can, and avoid any situation where your chances for success are terrible. In order to assist in these decisions, you have 4 key stats: strength, dexterity, intelligence, and health. While all of these stats affect your interactions with certain special kinds of objects, your strength primarily affects how much damage you can do and how much gold you can carry at a time. Dexterity affects how often you can hit your targets. Your intelligence affects how many spell points you get. And your health obviously keeps you alive. Run out and it's game over. Moving around in this game is done with the numeric keypad, though you're not actually allowed to move diagonally even though the enemies can. You may also need to turn numlock off and on again when running the game in DOSBox to get the controls to register properly. As you move around, you'll uncover various parts of the dungeon. Now, unlike most dungeon crawls where you have to have a direct line of sight to see something, in this game, once you've mapped a particular area, you'll always know when enemies happen to cross into that area, so it's a lot more simplified in that regard. Another thing that works differently from the norm is the combat. In the combatant enemy in this game, you don't run into the enemy or use special attack buttons, you actually move onto the same space the enemy is occupying, which will perform one round of combat where you'll get one attack in and the enemy will get one attack in. Then, to continue performing more rounds of combat, you can just press any key on the keyboard to bypass moving and force the next turn to come up. If, however, the battle isn't going so well, or you don't want to fight for whatever reason, just move off of the enemy's space to get away. Granted, enemies with a fast speed rating move just as fast as you do and are impossible to escape from without magic. Now, while escape might seem cowardly, you have to keep a couple very important things in mind while playing this game. You have no inventory, and you really want to map out each dungeon level in its entirety before you start picking items up in the first place, since picking up items activates them immediately. There are some exceptions to this though. For instance, dexterity potions really help with combat since they raise your dexterity up so much that virtually every attack you make will be successful. So dexterity potions you generally want to pick up when you see them. On the other hand, strength potions, while they can help you deal a lot of damage, they're better used for collecting large amounts of gold so you can gain experience faster, so you want to save them for when you know where all the gold is. Yeah, the gold is an interesting aspect of this game. When you find bags of gold lying around, you can only pick up as much as you can carry, after which all remaining gold in the pile is lost. This means the higher your strength is, the more gold you can carry. But don't worry if you happen to pick up a ton of gold while under the influence of a strength potion, then have the potion run out before you can reach a temple, because the maximum gold limit only applies to when you're actually picking gold up, not carrying the gold. Once you bring your gold to a temple, it's converted into experience points. Get enough experience points and you can raise one of your 4 basic stats. You can also find gems which increase your gold count, but they aren't limited by your strength like actual gold is. Beyond finding temples on each level to donate your gold to for experience, you can also rest assured that every dungeon floor will have a healing potion that will restore a good chunk of health, and that every time you enter a new area, your spell points will be restored to maximum. Now this is something you can actually take advantage of, either by casting time-limited spells right before entering a new area, or if you're out of spell points and get poisoned, you can rush down a staircase to the next level and instantly cast your cure spell to get rid of the poison. One thing you're going to be cursing all the way through this game, though, are the traps. There's a massive number of different kinds of traps you'll encounter, but many of them disguise themselves as crossed swords, which normally represent weapons and armor to pick up, or sometimes even maps of the entire area. What it basically comes down to is that, as tempting as those items are to pick up, just don't. At least not until you're done with everything else in the level and have plenty of spare health on hand. The safer way to get items is to defeat named enemies, whose names show up in a different color other than white, as these enemies always drop an item or treasure of some sort after you defeat them. Unfortunately, some traps are also completely invisible, and I feel this is one aspect of the game that simply doesn't work. Especially since one of the invisible traps you can trigger causes a cave-in which completely erases your mapping progress, forcing you to remap the entire level all over again. Furthermore, messages are cancelled simply by pressing absolutely any key on the keyboard, even when you're only supposed to clear them with the return key, which means when it comes to the invisible traps, you'll often trigger one yet completely miss the message that pops up on screen because you cleared it away thinking you were about to move another space into a clear and open area. Not to mention, erasing the map just feels kind of backwards and annoying. I wouldn't have such a big problem with the invisible traps if there was a way to make them visible, but short of finding maps, I haven't encountered any way of doing so. There is a nullify trap spell, but it's only really useful for figuring out if a pair of crossed swords really represents an item or not. Beyond that, it's just totally random where these invisible traps are located, and it's the only frustrating aspect of the game that simply cannot be overcome through gameplay experience. You just have to suffer through it and hope for the best. The only other real problem I have with this game is thankfully addressed in the Windows version, and that's the lack of having any way of identifying what you're dealing with. And in the Windows version of this game, if you click on something, the game gives you a detailed description of what you clicked on and what will happen if you interact with it. The DOS version doesn't do this, which can result in some rather cheap deaths. For instance, on screen right now was my best playthrough. I was doing well, had a good chunk of health, almost got to a double-digit dungeon level, then stumbled upon a fountain, and to the best of my knowledge at the time, drinking from a fountain wasn't going to be a deadly experience, as my previous attempts to drink from fountains all resulted in good things. Yeah, that really happened. Well, this is why being able to learn about things by clicking on them is such an invaluable feature, especially in a game where death is permanent regardless of any saving you've been doing. Besides which, the Windows version has race selection, character classes, skills you can learn, friendly NPCs you can interact with, and yes, it even has an inventory. And don't get me wrong, the Windows version is still freaking hard, but at least it's a heck of a lot more approachable, and while random chance does still heavily factor into everything, there's plenty more ways to manipulate those odds. Not to mention it has an interesting array of sound effects, including some voice work. And I kinda like the sounds in the Windows version, even though they're completely ridiculous. Really, just try it for yourself, you'll see what I mean. However, if you really want to take a look at the DOS version for whatever reason, just make sure you set a fixed cycles count of about 20,000 in DOSBox and you shouldn't run into too many issues. There are some speed issues though with the game, and I couldn't really find any DOSBox settings that could get around them. And again, remember to flick numlock off and on again just to get the numeric keypad working properly. One last thing before we draw this episode to a close. I actually did manage to get in touch with Jeff Sinisak before doing this episode. And guess what? There's a Caverns of Xaskazien 2 in the works. What you're seeing on screen right now are some screenshots of the game in its current state, which are actually much higher resolution than this, so I'll have some links on my website to view the full res screenshots. Now, from what Jeff Sinisak told me, when version 5.0 of the original game was released back in February of 2010, the source code had started to get a bit too complex and convoluted, and had some rather annoying bugs that started to creep in as a result. So he figured a better approach than trying to fix all these problems would just be to make a totally new game using a totally new engine. And as you can see, it's come a long way, and the number of features present is going to trump the original game by far. While he is expecting to get this game released next year, it could literally be out within a couple weeks, or numerous months from now. There's some programming issues he needs to resolve first, and since making games is his hobby, not his job, there's all kinds of things that could happen to get in the way of all this. Really, there's just no surefire way to predict when it'll all be ready to go. And being a game designer myself, I can safely say that trying to figure out when your game's going to be ready is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. He does intend to release the game on his personal website, though, at www.jeffsinisak.com. So if you're interested in seeing what he's got in store for the next iteration of Caverns of Xaskazien, then that's the place you want to keep tabs on. Personally, even though I found the DOS version of the original game frustrating beyond belief, the Windows version is much more playable, and I'm definitely looking forward to this next game in the series. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week for episode 95, we're finally going to take a look at one of the most beloved shareware platformers ever created. And I'm pretty sure I don't have to say anything more than that, so if you think you know which game it is, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday to see it in action.